Today's lesson, we're going to be exploring some different ways to categorize a country's level of development. Now, these models have their own pros and cons because there's really no one perfect way to categorize development. Even coming up with a definition for what development is can be tricky in and of itself. So some of these models that we'll be discussing today, they're out of date. These things come and go. They're updated over time, and the way that we view development changes over time. So different ways and modes of categorizing countries have been proposed over time. Some of these are no longer seriously considered by academics. Others, however, are still commonly used, but again, they have their own sets of problems. There's pros and cons to each of these. Now, in this lesson, we're going to be looking at a few different models for categorizing development. We'll be explaining the methods for these models and how they were developed, and then we'll also be evaluating exactly how they work, how well they work. We'll begin by trying to establish what exactly development is by examining the Human Development Index, a stat for comparing how highly developed countries are to one another. We will then be discussing several different models for categorizing countries. And those models are the idea of comparing developed versus developing countries, the three worlds model, Walt Rostow's model of development, dependency theory, and finally world systems theory. So I just want to start off here with a quote, and so it says, "Development has been seen as a race in which the West is the leader and the third world has lagged behind, meaning they must catch up to us. This idea has been the driving force behind the widespread poverty that many nations find themselves in today." So what this quote's doing here is it's looking at this idea of development critically, that even though we throw this term around that, we want to develop farther, that it's a way of progressing, and that it's good for countries to develop, this is a tricky concept to really pin down. And we can kind of get stuck in pigeonholed into certain ways of thinking of development. So what is being said here is that the way we viewed development in the West for decades is that it's a race towards becoming more like the West. That the only way to develop is to become more westernized. There's only one path to development. That the third world needs to catch up. They need to become more like Western countries. And this is a common criticism of the notion of development and how it works and how our political systems deal with development. It fails to recognize, what if a country doesn't see westernization as modernization? What if they don't view those things as the same thing? So, for example, the loss of culture that might come along with becoming more westernized. So it's one of the issues that is sometimes brought up in terms of this idea of development that challenges sort of our conventional notions of what it is and what it means. So again, to try to make this a more objective study as opposed to just throwing out terms like development, we can look at actual stats to try to assess how developed a particular place is. And one useful stat for evaluating a country's level of development is something called the Human Development Index, or HDI. Now, this is a stat that was developed a few decades back, in the 1990s, by economists, and it's meant to replace old metrics that measure development only through economic terms. So it thought of development as how rich were you, how much money did you have, how wealthy was your country. It ignored the human aspect of development. HDI tries to rectify that. So it's a composite stat that takes into account different stats. So things like life expectancy, education rates, so things like literacy rates, as well as per capita income. It's not solely focused on wealth. It's also looking at human development as well. Now, the way that this works is that countries with high HDI scores, they would tend to have high life expectancies, high education rates, people tend to be literate, they have low fertility rates, low birth rates, and high per capita incomes. And the opposite would be true for low HDI countries. And this stat is it's updated annually by the United Nations Development Program. And this map here is just showing what different countries look like in terms of development. So the darker the color is for a country on this map, the more developed they are, the higher their HDI scores are. So you can see there's a high concentration in North America, Canada and the United States, very highly developed countries. In Western Europe, almost every country in Europe would be considered highly developed, as well as places like Japan, South Korea, Australia. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have many low developed countries in Africa. And so this chart here is showing the top 10 countries in terms of Human Development Index according to the 2015 survey. And so you can see here Norway tops the list with an HDI score of 0.944. And you can see a little bit farther down the list here, Canada in a tie for 9th place with New Zealand at 0.913. Now, once you get sort of into the top 10 or the top tier of HDI, there really isn't a ton of separation between countries. I mean, living in Canada versus the US versus Germany versus Switzerland, there's not a huge difference in terms of your standard of living between these countries on average. But if we were looking at countries in the top 10 versus the bottom 10, you would see a drastic change. And so these are the bottom 10 countries for Human Development Index. So at the bottom of the list here is Niger with a HDI score of 0.348, far lower than those countries we just saw at the top of the list. And one thing you might notice about this list of countries is that whereas the previous list had countries from several different continents, there is one continent exclusively listed here, and that's Africa. In fact, the lowest ranked countries that are outside of Africa are Afghanistan, which is ranked 171st in the world, and Haiti, which is ranked 163rd in the world. So there's a lot of countries in Africa which are less developed, the lowest developed countries in the world, according to HDI. And that brings us into our first way of categorizing countries, which is this idea of developed countries and highly developed countries versus less developed or developing countries. So developed nations, you might see them referred to as HDC, so highly developed nations, developed countries, they all mean the same thing. These are industrialized countries whose economies have created higher levels of consumerism, wealth, and development of infrastructure. And their characteristics include things such as industrialization and the manufacturing of products. So there's an industrial manufacturing base there. Lots of people are working outside of the agriculture sector. You have people who are actually manufacturing things, making things, a large service sector. High levels of consumerism. So there's people who are, rich enough to actually purchase those products. They have advanced networks and infrastructure. So they have things like telephone networks and roads and highways and railways and airports. They have a high participation rate in university and college education. So people are not only able to go to school, they are able to take higher studies as well. There's ownership and control of large amounts of capital. So things like banking institutions are present. The formation and hosting of multinational corporations, so large companies that operate throughout the world. They're centers of global communication. They're centers of political power and influence. So the more developed a country is, the more political power, the more power on the world stage they tend to have. Again, if we looked at those countries at the top 10 of HDI, they have a lot of sway in the international community. Whereas the lower you go on the list, the less influence you tend to have. And again, these are countries with high HDI scores. That's why they're highly developed. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have least developed countries or developing countries, or underdeveloped countries is another way of putting it. Again, some of the language around here, the way that we look at development is important in terms of what we're going to call them. And now these countries tend to have economies that are based primarily on agriculture. They have high rates of poverty. So there's a very low GDP per capita. People are not making a lot. People do not have the means to support themselves in many cases. They have less access to healthcare, less access to education, less access to clean water on average. Very low rates of adult literacy. So especially when compared with highly developed countries where virtually everyone is literate as an adult. We see far lower rates among least developed countries. They tend to have large rural populations, again, because their economies are based so much on agriculture. People tend to live away from cities, and they have less influence internationally. And again, we score this based on their low HDI scores. Now, countries can develop. But by no means are they stuck in their category. So many countries that we once would have described as developing, we now consider them to be newly industrialized, somewhere in the middle, or medium developed. So these are countries that have not quite reached the status of highly developed countries, but have nonetheless grown at a faster rate than other developing countries. So this is when their economies are beginning to turn from agriculture to manufacturing. They're starting to have that base. And again, they begin to have more influence internationally. So one example of a country like this would be Mexico, which if we look back 75, 100 years ago would have been much more rural, much more reliant on agriculture. Today has a much more diversified economy, a much bigger manufacturing base. And within this level of development, we find what we call the BRICS countries, which are a few examples of these sort of medium developed countries. And so the BRICS countries, it stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Again, they're powerful emerging economies. And again, they've grown past the developing stage. They're on the path to being highly developed. And they have the potential to have a lot of power internationally. In fact, countries like Russia, China, arguably are two of the three most powerful countries in the world today, along with the United States. And then you look at some of these other countries, India, for example, with a large population, the second largest country in the world, a growing manufacturing base, the potential to be one of those countries in the near future. And then other countries such as Mexico, Turkey, Indonesia, those are other countries which, even though they're not part of the they're not a member of the BRICS relationship. These countries actually work together in certain circumstances to advance their advance economic goals. Countries like Mexico, Turkey, and Indonesia, they sort of fall into the same category. They're medium developed. They have a growing manufacturing base. They could one day become sort of an emerging power in the next few decades. Now, although this idea of comparing countries that are less developed versus those that are more developed, that's kind of the prevalent way of categorizing development today. This hasn't always been the case. In the past, we've had other classification systems. Now, the difference is that these old systems, they mostly focused on economics. They focused on economic systems as well as growth of wealth. And so probably the most well-known of these systems is called the three worlds model. And so we still use a lot of this language today. We talk about living in the first world, or we talk about poverty in the third world. Even though these terms, again, come out of an old way of categorizing, which really isn't all that relevant today. Really, it emerges out of the Cold War. And you can see it very blatantly in the way they choose to categorize countries. They're categorized based on what economic system they have. So the three worlds model split the world up into three worlds. The first world, which was the free world, so countries with democratic capitalist economies. So that would be the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, those countries that had democratically elected governments and had a capitalist free market economy. On the other hand, you had the second world, which is the communist world. So the USSR, China, and their allies. So countries that had communist governments. And then the third world, this was the battleground. These were the countries that hadn't, picked a side yet, is the way that it would have been viewed at the time. Now, there's many limitations to this model, even though we still use a lot of this language today. Probably the biggest limitation is that it sees the world as black and white. There's no in between. You're either with us or you're against us. And the third world has to pick a side. Those countries, it's a race to see who can get more allies on their side. Get those third world countries to adopt your mindset, your way of developing, either the capitalist or the communist mode of development. And it also, again, there's not as much nuance to this system. So, for example, what about social democracies with mixed economies? Or a country like Canada, where we have, we're not a completely free market. We have things like the healthcare system, the education system that are publicly funded, as well as other important industries. It's not that we are, one extreme, a complete free market. So the world is not black and white. Countries have different types of economies. Even if they're more free market than communist, they can have aspects of both. We have mixed economies throughout the world. So it leaves no room for that. And another big downside to this categorization system is that you would have countries that didn't neatly fit into them. So one really good example of this was Mexico. So Mexico, if you were to read a textbook from the 1970s, would often get grouped in with the Second World. Not because they had a communist economy. They've never been a communist state or a socialist state. It was because they weren't quite third world. They were more developed than these countries, but they weren't a first world country. They weren't as highly developed. So they just kind of got stuck in here. They had more in common with these countries, even though they weren't communist. So it didn't really have a good place of, for a fit for these countries that were developing, that were growing in their stage of development. There wasn't a place for them to go in this system. And so this is what the world looked like according to the three worlds model. And so you can see here, you got Canada and the United States, Western Europe, which are considered part of the free world. We have the countries in red here, so Russia, China, Vietnam. They are the communist world. You got Cuba in here too. And then everyone else, they're the third world countries. They're the ones who it's a race to get them on your side. And this leads, again, this is the dominant way that the world is viewed during the Cold War. And this leads to, has a lot of influence on the foreign policy of both America and the Soviet Union. So, for example, the American policy of containment, the idea that we have to contain communism where it already exists. Again, during the Cold War, the U.S. did not want to risk a full-scale war, either a conventional war or a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So they weren't going to, go to war with them over, the countries in Eastern Europe that were communist or, over Russia itself. They weren't fighting them over that, but they didn't want these other countries to fall to communism. So, for example, that's why the U.S. was involved in Vietnam for so long. They didn't want Vietnam to fall to communism. Or the U.S. involvement in the Korean War. They didn't want Korea to fall to communism. Now, the next model we're going to look at here, again, comes directly out of this paradigm. And this was a model that was proposed by a social scientist in 1960, a man named Walt Rostow. And this is his model of development. Now, according to the historian Michael Latham, he said about Rostow's model that for Rostow, his intellectual cohort and the policymakers they advised, the concept of modernization was the process of global change and identifying ways the United States could accelerate, challenge, and direct it. So this model here is really about how do we make the world more safe for free economies, and how can development of countries be in line with that. And we can see this right in the name of the paper that he writes in support of this model. So it's called The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non Communist Manifesto. This is what he's writing about his modernization theory. It's directly opposed to communism. He says it right there in the title. This is how do we prevent communism from spreading throughout the world. And his model was highly influential in American international development initiatives in the post-war era. So, for example, the Peace Corps is one institution that's formed at this time, and it's about spreading American development principles throughout the third world. And Rostow theorized that societies evolved through 5 stages. That's how he viewed a development. That there's 5 stages that countries move through as they become more developed. And again, at this point, he's concerned with how countries can be accelerated through this model, down the capitalist path. And to just quickly go through what those stages are. So stage 1 is the traditional society. So this is where the economy is based on subsistence farming. You might have some fishing, some mining, some forestry, but the economy is based off of working off the land, working with primary resources. What can you get off of the land? From there, you move on to stage 2, which is called the preconditions for takeoff. So this is when you start building the infrastructure that's needed to become industrialized. So for example, transportation networks start to be built. You might have railways or roadways built. You get communications networks set up. So this is in the 1800s, that might be something like the telegraph. If this is in the 1900s, that might be phone lines. If it's today, that would be, the internet or Wi-Fi. At stage 3, this is the takeoff stage. This is when you start having rapid growth in industry and in the economy, an industrial revolution. So again, the United States, Canada, Western Europe went through this in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And this is when manufacturing really takes off. You have increased investment in those businesses, and it's a complete cultural change. People no longer need to live off the land. Cities start to grow. You start to have a huge urban population, and eventually the majority of people live in cities as opposed to in the countryside. Stage 4, Rostow called the drive to maturity. This is where new ideas and technology improve and replace older industries. Economic growth spreads throughout the country. So now this isn't just concentrated in sort of the big cities. It's all throughout the country. So for example, when Canada first started to industrialize and develop in the 1800s, this would have been really concentrated in areas like Montreal and Toronto. But obviously, Canada today is not just, our manufacturing base, our economic base is not just concentrated in those 2 cities. We have plenty of places throughout the country which are not rural or agrarian. And this is something that Rostow identified, that this would happen as a country matures, that the wealth and diversity would spread throughout the country. And the final stage Rostow identified was called high mass consumption. So people have more wealth, there's a middle class, and they're able to buy more goods and services. Consumerism is the driving force behind the economy. And this is also when we start to see things like welfare systems that are put in place. A country becomes developed enough that not only are people able to accumulate wealth, there are social safety nets in place in case they fall on hard times. And this is also when a country starts to expand in terms of international trade. They might have free trade deals with other countries or special deals to improve their trade relationships with other countries. Now you might notice the final stage that Rostow has identified, and really the way that he's developed from stage 1 to 5, this really is a country becoming more capitalist. How they get pushed down that road towards capitalism. So there are many criticisms that have been laid upon Rostow's model. So, for example, one is that it assumes everyone wants to modernize, and that there's only one path to modernity. It also assumes that modernity can only look one particular way. It assumes that the only way you can industrialize is the same way that North America and Western Europe did it in the 1800s. So it denies the validity of perhaps non-Western value systems. And so this also, again, the idea that some cultures might be less materialistic than others. They might be seen as more communist in this light. Even if it has nothing to do with an economic system, it's a cultural difference. And it also ignores that capitalism can cause inequality, both within a country and internationally. So capitalism, there are winners and losers. Some people become more wealthy, some countries become more wealthy, others less so. And Rostow's model, again, doesn't really encapsulate this, or at least recognize it as a potential problem. So this leads us to our next theory, which really can be thought of as a response to Rostow's theory, or sort of the yin to its yang, and that's dependency theory. So dependency theory is developed out of Marxist ideology, again, based on the ideas of Karl Marx, the 19th century philosopher, the founder of Marxism, the ideology that communism comes out of, and socialism and other related fields and ideas. So it theorizes that capitalism creates both poverty and wealth, and that this is true and relevant in development. Now, this idea was particularly popular in Latin America in the post-war era, mostly because of the lack of economic development that followed the war. Whereas Europe was recovering from the war nicely, their economies were developing, they were back on the path to prosperity, Latin America was kind of left behind in many ways. And so this theory would state that poverty is not a natural state. It would say that capitalism creates both poverty and wealth through uneven development. It doesn't just happen. Capitalist societies explicitly allow for inequalities to develop, and in fact, in many cases, encourage those inequalities to develop. So as an example, advocates of dependency theory would argue that the third world did not happen by accident. It was created by capitalism. So, for example, the third world is actively created through colonialism. The first world made the third world poor. It was created through centuries of colonial policy. That would be looking through a Marxist dependency theory lens. That's why poverty exists in certain places around the world and not others. And again, if we think back to what we know about colonialism, there is some validity to this idea. So, for example, if you think back to mercantilism, colonialist governments often suppressed development of manufacturing in colonized countries. They were the raw material centers. They were used to extract wealth out of, whether that was food or metals or diamonds. It was some kind of raw good, and there was no need for a manufacturing base there. So these countries are at a distinct disadvantage. And we can also think of some of the problems that come along with a resource economy, especially in a free market. If the price for your good that your economy is based around, if that price drops, your entire economy is in the tank. Think of the price of oil. When the price of oil is high, regions that rely heavily on it are doing good. There's jobs for everybody. There's lots of wealth to go around. But if the price of oil declines really quickly, a lot of people are out of jobs. A lot of people are in poverty. It's really hard for people to make ends meet. So in a free market, this is relying on a resource economy is not necessarily always a sustainable thing. And so as a result, we saw lots of policies develop in Latin America in particular that were that stressed self-sufficiency, the idea that Latin America should look out for itself first. And there was a high mistrust of foreign multinational corporations. And so one striking example of this is the United Fruit Company's involvement in Guatemala in the 1950s. So you might know the United Fruit Company. They eventually become Chiquita Banana. They were very influential in Guatemala following World War II. So what happened was Guatemala's democratically elected government, they tried to pressure United Fruit to reform their practices. Some of their business practices, they weren't paying people well. They weren't letting people go on strike. They were restricting. United Fruit was discriminating against people based on race. So the democratically elected government of Guatemala was trying to pass reforms to make the situation better. United Fruit, a rich company based in the United States, were very resistant to this. Again, they're in this to make money. And the Guatemalan government, they came to power, and they had plans to take control of land that was owned by United Fruit Land that wasn't being actively used for banana cultivation, they were going to nationalize that land and redistribute it to the poor. And you can probably see already why this might strike people in the United States as they might be suspicious of this. This sounds very socialist, very communist. You're taking land away from a private company and handing it out to the poor. So this definitely would have arose the suspicions of the United States government, and it certainly did. So this was viewed by the United States. Again, they have these fears of communism. They don't want it to spread. And they fear that Guatemala is going to align themselves with the Soviets, and that once they go, it's a domino effect. Every other country in Latin America is going to fall to the Soviets, and now you have all these communist countries right on your, right at your front door that you now have to deal with. So the United States wants to do everything they can to avoid this situation. So United Fruit, they lobbied the U.S. government to intervene, and we actually see the CIA back a covert operation to overthrow that democratically elected government in Guatemala. And again, there's lots of interconnections between business and government here. So, for example, the United States Secretary of State at the time, John Foster Dulles, him and his brother Alan both had interests in United Fruit. They had served on the board of directors at different times. So you see here, there's this idea of people in Latin America were especially distrustful of these foreign companies because they had, again, all this wealth. They, were viewed negatively by the people there, the labor that was being discriminated against. And then there's these connections to, again, these covert operations to overthrow a democratically elected government and install a military dictatorship in its place. Now, the final categorization system that we're going to talk about today is called world systems theory. Now, this was developed in the 1970s, and it comes out of dependency theory. And it's actually developed by an American sociologist. Now, where dependency theory only focused on developing nations, world systems theory tried to look at this in terms of the entire global economy. And it really emphasized the role of big powers, of superpowers in the world economy. And it split the world into a core and a periphery. So according to world systems theory, the world system is structured around a core, which here is Western Europe, Japan, the United States, Canada would be in this group, a periphery, which is the third world, and then a quasi-developed semi-periphery. So this would be Eastern Europe, the Soviet bloc, and Mexico. And again, there's this real emphasis on the role of a superpower in keeping the system stable. And according to this model, the stability is determined by the efforts of a single world power to keep the balance of trade and the balance of power in check. So, for example, this would have been Britain in the 19th century, or the United States in the 20th century and beyond. Now, it also acknowledges that it's possible for economic development in developing nations. However, global growth is seen as a zero-sum game by this categorization system. So some places may win, they may grow, but only if others lose and their economies suffer. And again, you can see some of this rhetoric that's actually still used today. If you listen to speeches by Donald Trump when he's talking about trade, he talks about trade as a zero-sum game, that China and Mexico are winning the trade war, that they're taking advantage of the United States, and that they're using them as a piggy bank. You hear a lot of this rhetoric thrown around by Trump. Again, it's kind of based, a lot of it seems to be based out of this sort of worldview that growth is really just a zero-sum game. Not everybody can grow. And so this map here is sort of showing what this would have looked like. So you can see here again, certain similarities to the other categorization systems, but again, it doesn't acknowledge that, again, everybody can benefit. Even if China is developing, does that really necessarily mean that the United States and Canada can't be prosperous as well? And these are just some of the conclusions that we can take from world systems theory. So it would conclude that economic landscapes, they're the result of influences from things like the natural environment. So what kinds of products can you develop and then ship around the world and sell? Your history, so where you come from and how much power you've had around you, as well as your contemporary political, economic, and cultural forces. It concludes that profit maximization and global economies tend to generate uneven economic development, so that we do have places that are the core and then the periphery. That individual regions are linked to one another through dense networks of trade, investment, migration, and communication. And finally, it concludes that flows of capital across space are primarily means by which economic geographies are constructed. So in summary, today we learned that HDI is a composite statistic that is used to identify countries that are more or less developed and focuses on overall human well-being. Historically, other classification systems have been used which primarily look at economic development. The three worlds theory divided the world into the first, the free world, the second, the communist world, and the third world. Walt Rostow proposed that societies follow a strict 5-step path towards modernization. Dependency theory argues that differences in development are caused by capitalist exploitation. And finally, world systems theory proposes that the world is split into a core and a periphery.